Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I'm actually doing this today on my very old laptop that I've had for over 13 years. It is super slow, so I'm just testing it right now because I'm hoping to do some interviews soon, and I just feel like my laptop would be easier to do it than on my phone. So I'm just testing this out and see how it works. I'm back reading The Red Tent. So for those of you who are following along, we are on chapter 2. I had already started chapter 2. It is a very long chapter, so I'll see how far I get into it today. It might actually have to be a 3-part video for this chapter, mom life. So I will put the playlist for the beginning and chapter 1, and as well as the beginning part of chapter 2 in the description. So I highly recommend that you start at the beginning of the book. For those of you that are following along, just a reminder, this is the 10th edition. So just in case all the other editions are different, I don't know. So it might be slightly different if you're following along. Again, just a reminder to you, I am really stepping out of my comfort zone to be reading out loud, especially to like an audience. I struggle with reading. When I was younger, I used to actually have to go to a speech therapist. So this is a new thing for me. I do struggle a lot with like names and places, and especially with these times, they're not names and places that I'm used to. So just bear with me for that. And again, just a reminder, because of the times that this book is, set in, there is a lot of, pedophilia, where men are marrying very young girls. You're going to hear things like polygamy, where men have more than one wife. You're also going to basically like incest, right? Where a lot of men married sisters and stuff too. So, again, just, bear with that part of the book. It is such a fantastic book. So I hope those of you that are already following along have been enjoying it. And so again, just a reminder, I started chapter 2 already, so I'm just gonna go to where I had finished off. Just a little bit of a recap. Leah had actually stepped in for Rachel, so she was covered for the wedding, and she was the one that married Jacob instead of Rachel. So they are now at their wedding night, and that's where we're going to start. So chapter 2, I'm on page 33. Okay. But I was afraid. I sank to the blanket and he moved quickly to my side. He stroked my hands, he touched my cheek, and then he was on top of me. I was afraid, but I remembered my mother's counsel and opened my hands and my feet and listened to the sound of my breath instead of his. Jacob was good to me. He was slow to enter me the first time, but he finished so quickly I barely had time to calm down before he fell still and heavy upon me like a dead man for what it seemed like hours. Then his hands came to life. They wandered over my face, through my hair, and though on my breast and belly to my legs and my sex, which he explored with the lightest touch. It was the touch of a mother tracing the inner ear of her newborn child. A feeling so sweet, I smiled. He looked at my pleasure and nodded. We both laughed, and then Jacob spoke tenderly to his first wife. My own father rarely addressed me and seemed to prefer my brother's company, he whispered. But once, while we were traveling, we passed a tent where a man was beating a woman, wife, concubine, or slave. We had no way of knowing. Isaac, my father, sighed and told me that he had never taken any woman to his bed, other but my mother, even though she had only given him 2 sons early in their marriage. Rebecca had welcomed him with tenderness and passion when they first were married, because as her groom, he treated her as though she were the queen of heaven, and he her consort. Their coupling was the coupling of the sea and the sky, of the rain and the parched earth, of night and day, wind and water. Sorry about that. Hopefully I won't have to pause this too much, but mom life, it's just how it is. So back to where I was. Their nights were filled with stars and sighs as they played the part of the goddess and god. Their touches and endured 1,000 dreams. They slept in each other's arms every night, except when it was her first time for the red tent or when she gave suck to her sons. That was my father's teaching about husbands and wives, said Jacob to Jacob, my father, to Leah, my mother, on their first night together. And then he wept over the loss of his father's love. Leah wept out of sympathy for her husband and also out of relief and joy at her good fortune. She knew that her own mother had cried on her wedding night too, but that those tears had been despair, for Laban had been a bore from the beginning. Leah kissed her husband, he kissed her. They embraced again and again, and even that first night when she was tender from being opened by a man, Leah responded to his touch. She liked the smell of him and the feel of his beard on her skin. When he entered her, she flexed her legs and her sex with a kind of strength that surprised her and delighted him. When Jacob cried out in his final pleasure, she was flooded by a sense of her own power. And when she followed her breathing, she discovered her pleasure and opening and a fullness that made her sigh and purr. And then she slept as she hadn't slept since she was a child. He called her Ayana and she called her Bali, brother, lover of Ishtar. They were left alone the full 7 days and 7 nights. Food was set out for them at dawn and at dusk, and they ate with the ravenous, sorry, my cat's like hunger of lovers. By the end of the week, they had made love in every hour of the day and night. They were certain they had invented 1,000 new methods for giving and taking pleasure. They had slept in each other's arms. They laughed like children at Lebaon's stupidity and Zilpha's strange ways, but they did not speak of Rachel. It was a golden week, every day sweeter, but every day sadder too. There would never be another time when Leah and Jacob could wonder in each other's memories or lounge during daylights in each other's in each other's arms. These were the only meals they would ever share, talking and finding each other's kindred spirits for business and families politics. They decided that Jacob would emerge from the week fearing anger. He would go to Lebaon and say, I have been duped. I was given strong wine and you gave me the harridan, Leah, rather than my beloved Rachel. My labor for Rachel was repaid with a swindle, for when I demand restoration. And although I spent these 7 days and 7 nights with your eldest girl, as my duty required, I do not consider her my wife until you make me a dowry in her name, and until Rachel is also mine. And that is precisely what Jacob said when he left the tent. I will take the maiden Zilpah as dowry for Leah, and just as Bilhah will be dowry for Rachel, I will take another tenth of your herd for relieving you of your ill-favored daughter. And to be fair, I will work for you another 7 months as the bride price for Leah. Those are my terms. Jacob made this speech before everyone in camp on the day he and Leah emerged from their seclusion. Leah kept her eyes on the ground as her husband recited the words they had rehearsed the night before, naked, sweating each other's sweat. She pretended to cry while she twisted her mouth to keep from laughing. As Jacob proclaimed himself, Ada nodded assent. Zilpah turned white at the mention of her name. Lebaon, who had spent the week drunk in honor of his daughter's marriage, was so Stupefied, he could barely sputter a protest before throwing up his hands, cursing the lot of them, and returning to the dark of his tent. Rachel spat at Jacob's feet and stormed off. By the end of the nuptial week, she had come to regret her panic. She had lost forever her possession as first wife, and then she had heard the sounds from the bridal tent, laughter and muffled cries of pleasure. Rachel had poured out her sorrows to Bilhah, who took her to see the dogs, mating, and 2 sheep, none of whom seemed to suffer in the act. One moment. Rachel went to the village and told Ina what had happened. Ina told her tales of passion and pleasure and took Rachel inside her hut and showed her how to unlock the secrets of her own body. When Jacob found Rachel at their accustomed tree, she cursed him soundly, calling him a thief and a bastard, a devil and a pig who inserted himself into sheep and goats and dogs. She accused him of not loving her. She shrieked that he must have known it was Leah, even when she was veiled, sitting beside him at the wedding feast. He could have stopped it. Why hadn't he? She cried bitterly. When her tears were spent, Jacob held her to his chest until it seemed she was asleep and told her that she was the moon's own daughter, luminous, radiant, and perfect, that his love for her was worshipful, that he felt only duty toward Leah, who was a mere shadow of Rachel's light, that she, only Rachel, would be the bride of his heart, his first wife, his love. Such pretty treason. So it happened that the day before the next full moon, there was a second wedding feast, even simpler than the first, and Rachel took her turn in the tent with Jacob. I do not know much about that week, for Rachel never spoke of it. No tears were heard coming from the nuptial tent of Jacob and Rachel, what was a good sign. No one overheard laughter either. When the week was over, Rachel crept to the red tent before dawn, where she slept into the following morning. After the first new moon after Leah's bridal week, there was no blood between her legs, but she kept this news to herself. Amid the herd preparations for Rachel's wedding, it was easy enough to conceal the fact that she did not really need to change her place on the straw or use a rag between her legs when she moved around. 2 days after Rachel entered the nuptial tent with Jacob, Leah went to her mother and put Ida's dry hand on her young belly. The older woman hugged her daughter. I do not think I would live to see a grandchild, she said to Leah, smiling and crying at once. Beloved girl, daughter of mine. Leah said she kept quiet about her pregnancy to protect Rachel's happiness. Her status as head wife would be assured with the birth of a son, and she knew from the fir- from the first that she was carrying a boy. But Rachel was furious when she learned that Leah was with child. She thought her sister had kept the news from her as part of a complicated plot to shame her, to assure her own role as first wife, as a way to cause Jacob to abandon her. Rachel's accusations could be heard from as far away as the well, which was a good distance from the tent where she bellowed. She accused Leah of asking Zilpah to help cheat her of her rightful place. She she insinuated that Leah was pregnant not by Jacob, but by a hair-lip, half-witted shepherd who loitered at the well. You jealous bitch, Rachel screamed. You evil-eyed Lumux, you only wish Jacob loved you as he loves me, but he never will. I am the one. I am his heart. You are a broad mare, you pathetic cow. Leah held her tongue until Rachel was finished. Then she calmly called her sister an ass and slapped her face hard, first on one cheek and then on the other. They did not speak a word to each other for months. I suppose it only natural to assume that Leah was always jealous of Rachel. And it was true that Leah did not sing or smile much during Jacob's week with Rachel. Indeed, over the years, whenever my father took my beautiful aunt to his bed, my mother kept her head bent over her work, which grew as her sons increased and as Jacob's labors yield more wool to be woven. But Leah was not jealous in the way of silly girls and love songs who die of longing. There was no bile in Leah's sadness when Jacob lay with his other wives. Indeed, she delighted in all his sons and had most of them at her own breast at one time or another. She could depend upon Jacob to call for her once or twice in a month for talk about the herds and for an extra cup of sweet beer. On those nights, she knew they would sleep together, her arms locked with his waist, and the next morning her family would bask in her smile and enjoy something good to eat. But I am rushing my story, for it took years before Leah and Rachel finally learned how to share a husband. And at first, they were both like dogs, circling and growling and giving each other wide berth as they exploded the bounty between them. Even so, at first, it seemed a kind of parity would prevail, because at the next new moon, Rachel too found she had no use for the rags or the hay. Both sisters were pregnant. The barley crop was enormous. The shepherd slapped Jacob on the back and joked about his potency. The gods were smiling, but just as Leah's belly began to swell against her tunic, Rachel started to bleed. Early one morning, nearly 3 months after her wedding, she she woke the camp with her cries. Leah and Zilpah rushed to her side and found her sobbing, wrapped in a bloody blanket. No one could comfort her. She would not let Ada sit with her. She would not permit Jacob to see her. For a week, she huddled in a corner of the red tent, where she ate little and slept dreamless, feverish sleep. Leah forgave Rachel her nasty words and grieved for her. She tried to tempt her with her favorite sweets, but Rachel spat at the food and at Leah, who seemed to grow bigger and rounder every day and as beautiful as she had ever been. It was so unfair, so sad, said Billa, who finally got Rachel to eat a few olives and coaxed her out of the stained, stiff blanket. Bilhah was the one who walked to the village where Ina lived to see if the midwife had some potion that might rouse her sister from her half dead. Ina herself came back and spent hours with Rachel, washing her, feeding her tiny bits of bread dipped in honey, coaxing her to take sips of an aromatic red mead. Excuse me. Ina whispered secret words of comfort and hope into Rachel's ear. She told her that bearing children would not be easy for her, but foretold that someday Rachel would bear beautiful sons who would shine like stars and assure her memory. Ina promised to pull all her skills to work to help Rachel conceive again, but only if she would do exactly what the midwife told her to do. That is why when Leah in her 6 month sought her sister's blessing, Rachel put her hands on Leah's belly and caressed the life there. Rachel cried in her sister's arms, kissed Ada's hand, and asked Zilpha to comb her hair. She took Bilhah aside, embraced her, and thanked her for bringing Ina. It was the first time Rachel had thanked anyone for anything. The next morning, Leah and Rachel, side by side, walked out of the darkness of the red tent and back into the light of the world where Jacob stood. Rachel said he wept when he saw them together, but Leah said he smiled. Leah's firstborn was not especially difficult, said Rachel. By the time she told me the story of Reuben's arrival, my aunt had seen hundreds of babies born. And though Rachel would forget where she put her spindle at moments, she put it down. She remembered the details of every birth she had ever witnessed. She told me that even though Leah's trivial began before sunset and did not end until daylight, it was a straight path. His head was down and his hips and her hips were wide enough. Still, the heat of the summer night in the red tent was stifling, and none of the sisters had ever seen a birth. Truly, Leah suffered most because of her sister's fear. It began slowly in the afternoon with small grabbing pains in her back. Leah smiled after each siege, glad to be started, eager to be admitted to the sisterhood of mothers, confident that her body, so broad and big, would fulfill its purpose. She sang in the early stages, children's songs, ballads, lullabies. But as the night wore on and the moon rose in the sky and then started to sink, there were no more smiles or songs. Each contraction took Leah up and wrung her out like a bit of cloth and left her panting and fearful of the next pain. Ida held her hand. Zilpha muttered prayers to Aneth. I was of no use at all, Rachel remembered. I wandered in and out of the tent, eaten up by jealousy. But as the hours came and went, each one harder than the last, my envy waned, and I was horrified by the pain I saw on Leah, the strong one, the invincible ox who was on the ground trembling and wide-eyed. I was terrified by the thought that I might have been in her place, that I might yet be. And I'm sure that the very same thought made Zilpha and Bilhah shudder and keep silence while our sister labored. Bilhah finally realized that they needed more help than Ada could provide, and she went to fetch Ina, who arrived at daybreak. By that time, Leah was whimpering like a dog when Ina arrived. She put her hands on Leah's belly and then reached up inside her. She made her lie on her side and rubbed her back and thighs with a mint-scented oil. Ina smiled into Leah's face and said, "The baby is nearly at the door." And while she emptied her kit and she bade the woman, the woman gathered around to help their sister bring the baby. It was the first time I had seen a midwife's kit, Rachel said. The knife, the string, reeds for suction, amphora of cumin, hyssop, and mint oil. Ina put her 2 bricks on the ground and told Leah she would stand on them soon. She moved me and Zilpha on either side to lend support to Leah, squatted over a bed of clean straw. Zilpha and I became chairs with our arms around her shoulders and beneath her thighs. "You lucky girl," Ina said to Leah, who by then did not feel the least bit lucky. "Look at the royal throne the throne of your sisters you have." Ina talked and talked, banishing and frightened silence that had made a wall around Leah. Ina asked Ida about her aches and pains and teased Zilpha about the tangled mat of her hair. But whenever a contraction came, Ina had words for Leah only. She praised her, reassured her, told her, "Good, good, good, my girl. Good, good, good." Soon all of the women in the tent joined her in repeating, "Good, good, good," clucking like a clutch of doves. Ina began to massage the skin around Leah's bottom, which was swollen out of shape. She rubbed with stronger and stronger motions as the pains came closer and closer. And then she put Rachel's hand on Leah's belly and showed her how to press downward gently but firmly when the time came. She told Leah not to push until Leah bellowed curses. Rachel said, "I saw that baby come into the world as I had seen nothing before in my life. Clearly, without a thought to myself, I thought of my own mother who had seen this so many times, whose hands had guided so many souls into the world, but who died giving me life. But I had no time to be sorry for myself because suddenly a strange red bubble emerged from Leah's legs, and then almost immediately a flood of blood water washed down her thighs. Leah tried to stand, terrified, but Ina told her not to take her feet off the bricks. This was good, she said. He was coming. Leah pushed her face red, her eyes bulging, blue and green, glittering. Her legs were trembling as though they were would buckle at any moment. And it took all of Zilpha's and Rachel's strength to hold her. Then Ina told Bella to take Rachel's place so she could catch the baby. Perhaps the birth blood would rouse Rachel's womb to fill again, too. And so Rachel washed in the river of life. Leah roared and delivered her son. He was so big it took both Ina and Rachel to catch him, and he started to cry even before they raised him his head. No need for the reeds to clear out the baby's nose and mouth. They all laughed, tears streaming down their face, panting from the efforts of Leah's birth. They passed the baby around the tent, wiping him and kissing him, praising his limbs, his torso, his head, his little sex. They all talked at the same time, making more noise than any 6 women can make. Jacob cried out to the woman to tell him the news. You are a father, said Ina. Go away. We will send for you soon, and then you will see your son, your firstborn, when we have finished. They heard Jacob shout with joy and call out the news to Laban and Ruti and his barking dogs and the clouds in the sky. The afterbirth fell out of Leah, who was nearly asleep with exhaustion. Ina made her drink and eat before she rested and put the baby to Leah's breast where he nursed. Mother and son slept and the sisters covered them. Ida watched a grandmother smile in lingering even after she dozed off. Ina wrapped the placenta in an old rag and they buried it that night in the eastern corner of the Bamath as benefits of a firstborn son. A few hours later, when Leah awoke, she named the baby Reuben. It was a joyful shout of a name that fairly dared evil spirits to do him any harm. But Leah had no fears for the strapping boy. Jacob was sent for and greeted his son with great tenderness. So I think I am just going to stop there. I'm not quite done chapter 2, but as you can tell, I've had to pause many times. My son needs me, and that is an absolutely beautiful place to end. As a doula, I have been witness to births before, and that just brought up so many memories of attending births as well as my own births. And I personally just want to kind of revel in the thoughts and emotions that are coming right now and tend to my own son. So again, I will post the other videos in the description. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I look forward to hearing from you and we will chat soon. Take care.